10 years ago, on July 11th, 2013, developer Level 5, known for their famous Layton and Inazuma 11 series, published a small game about encountering and befriending creatures inspired by their likeness in Japanese folklore. However, little did they know that, over the years, this singular game was spawned a massive franchise encompassing toys, games, multiple anime, movies, and more, touching the hearts of many fans in Japan and across the globe. This game was Yokai Watch. To those who aren't aware, Yokai Watch is a monster collecting action RPG series where you befriend various yokai who help you fight in battle. Yokai aren't just fictional monsters, they're actually heavily inspired from actual real-life yokai, various spirits from Japanese myths and legends, such as the Nekomata. In this franchise, however, yokai are more toned down and depicted like mischievous spirits that possess humans and cause mischief and mayhem, though that isn't entirely inaccurate to their origin. The series begins with the main protagonist, Nate, or Keita, discovers an old gashapon, a Japanese capsule machine, in the middle of the forest while going bug catching. Upon inserting a coin into the machine and opening the capsule it gives him, he accidentally releases Whisper, a yokai who soon becomes an eccentric and charming yokai butler. Whisper then entrusts Nate with the Yokai Watch, a mysterious device which he uses to help discover the yokai around him in his daily life. By befriending these yokai, he's able to obtain their yokai medal, which he can use to summon them to his aid in battle. Over the course of the series, Nate, along with the help of his yokai friends, solves many problems caused by evil yokai, from small domestic troubles to world-ending catastrophes. The first game in the series, simply titled Yokai Watch, was a title that set the foundation for primary game mechanics and gave players an introduction to the world and characters of the series. The game is set up in a chapter-by-chapter structure. After the introduction described earlier plays out in Chapter 1, a unique scenario will play out in each chapter, usually involving Nate doing something average, such as hanging out with friends or family, discovering the involvement of one or multiple yokai and confronting them, and sometimes navigating through dungeon-like areas and fighting a really cool boss at the end. Some may complain about the laid-back nature of the game, and the fact that you're not going on an epic quest through lush locales, but I personally don't really mind. It's a really nice change of pace from other adventure games, where the main protagonist has to go on a long, treacherous journey to save the world from calamity and whatnot. The smaller scope also means you primarily stick with one town, your hometown of Springdale, and has different sub-areas such as Uptown and Downtown, Shoppers Row, Blossom Heights, and Mount Wildwood, and you get to know every square inch throughout the game, which makes it all the more memorable. The chapter-by-chapter structure also works hand-in-hand with this, as in each chapter, you get to go to different areas and build a meaningful connection with relevant inhabitants, such as your friends, your parents, the watch shop owner, etc. All of this helps to build a cohesive world that is very nostalgic and heartwarming. But what exactly do you do in Yokai Watch? What does the gameplay look like? Well, in the game, you roam around the city of Springdale, exploring different locations equipped with the titular Yokai Watch. A radar on the watch will alert you as to whether a yokai is nearby, pulsing and vibrating the closer you get towards one. When you know you're close, you can search the surrounding areas, be it the bushes, telephone poles, trash cans, undercarts, etc. When you find a yokai, you're then able to battle it with your own yokai friends. The combat system is pretty unique, and takes advantage of the 3DS's dual screens. In Yokai Watch 1 and 2, the battle system is set on a wheel, where you would have 6 party members, 3 in front, 3 in back, and you can control who's on the field at any time by using the L and R buttons to rotate the wheel. Party members in the front can either auto-attack, use a technique, inspire allies to boost stats or enemies to reduce them, guard against opposing attacks, or loaf. Loafing occurs more for certain personality types compared to others. Yokai are also divided by tribe, a measure of their personality: charming, shady, slippery, tough, heartful, mysterious, eerie, or legendary. By setting up 3 adjacent yokai of a specific tribe, your team can receive a tribe unity bonus, which gives them a major stat boost. They also have ranks, essentially tiers of strength and rarity, which include E, D, C, B, A, and S rank, with E ranks being the worst and most common, and S ranks being the best and most rare. And yokai of higher ranks usually have higher base stats than that of lower ranks, though I'm not entirely sure. While the yokai fight, you're able to assist your team through 4 primary methods. You can target a certain opponent using a pin, purify party members in the back that are inspirited, or use an item to heal or cause a stat buff. You can even choose a yokai whose soul meter is full to use a powerful ultimate move, which can either do massive damage, greatly heal allies, or inspirit multiple foes at once. This will however drain the soul meter, but you can fill it up again by doing more damage. You can even select a food item from your inventory to give to an opposing yokai, which will increase the chance that after the battle, they will want to join your side, with there being a highest chance if the yokai is given their favorite food, which you can see when you hover over them using the target feature, or if they're given a food which has a high befriending rate, which you can see in the item menu. While the battle system may initially seem simple and boring, given that the yokai do the attacking for you, as you progress through these games, you'll find that there's actually a lot more to do than you expect, and you'll have to be pretty careful with how you manage your team, especially during boss battles. These can be pretty tough, as you'll constantly be rotating team members, targeting different parts of the boss, and purifying allies. Most critics of the system tend to just take a glance at the gameplay and write it off as easy and boring, without having even played the game and being fully experienced to its more difficult sections. If I'm giving my own 2 cents here, I would presume that this is because they looked at the combat independently at face value, without looking at how it factors into the gameplay systems as a whole. The combat by itself is relatively simplistic, but this is done so that the yokai are given a lot more individuality. Each yokai is like a finely crafted chess piece, each with their own moveset, abilities, strengths, and weaknesses. Much like the game in question itself, rather than focusing on direct combat between opposing sides, the game is more focused on properly utilizing the interaction between each piece, although there is still a bit of the former present. This results in a level of team building which I never really had to consider too much in most RPGs I've played. They were mainly focused more on utilizing actions rather than the team members themselves. For me, this is truly what makes the yokai games really stand out amongst the rest. Speaking of the yokai, let's actually talk about the spirits themselves. What I love about the yokai is that, unlike some monster taming games, each yokai has its own quirky personality and voice, not just animalistic cries, that help make each of them individualistic. Some even have their own backstory and lore, which you can read in their entry in the Yokai Medallion, a book containing information about each yokai you befriend. This helps to make each yokai feel less like generic monsters which you use to battle, and more like actual characters. This is supplemented even more by the anime, which dedicates segments to developing each of their personalities and helps the viewer grow somewhat of a connection to them, even if it's mostly through comedy, but I'll focus more on that later on. This philosophy is integrated into the designs as well. In other monster taming games, the creatures you collect are animals that inhabit and are a fundamental part of the world, and their designs also reflect that. However, in Yokai Watch, these monsters are actually the spirits of dead animals, things, or people. For example, Wazat is the spirit of a hat who was formed from the regret of being abandoned by its owner. Blazion is the spirit of a circus lion who died protecting a child from a deadly fire, and Jabanion, the mascot, is the spirit of a house cat who died protecting its owner Amy from being hit by a truck. Given that the yokai are spirits, they don't necessarily have a singular design formula or methodology, because they don't have a singular basis. They aren't all animals or robots. Some are robots, but some are the typical mythical creatures from Japanese folklore. Some are dead humans, some are discarded objects, and some are even natural yokai beings that aren't dead. There is so much variety in the inspiration that allows the designs to be weird, wacky, and unique. Some of my personal favorite yokai from the first game have to be Jibanyan, Komasan, Komajiro, Shogunyan, Azure Dragon, and Gilgaros. Outside of battle, there are tons of things to do in the town as well. You can search around the overworld to catch various bugs and fish to trade in for points at the local Jungle Hunter store, which you can use to get rare items. You can upgrade your watch rank at the watch shop, timers, and more, which allows you to see stronger rank yokai. You can talk to Mr. Zen at Shoten Temple to fuse yokai and items to create brand new items and evolved yokai. although some need to level up instead to evolve. You can even return to the Gashapon and Mount Wildwood from the start of the game, and insert various special coins you receive to get special items and yokai, with the rarity of the rewards changing depending on the coin you input, although which of the rewards you'll get is also luck-based. Some yokai are even exclusive to the Crank, which makes it all the more enticing. You can also complete various side quests where you help citizens with menial tasks, and even participate in Terror Time. At random points during the game, you'll end up in an event called Terror Time, where the Oni Gargoyles will chase you throughout the streets of Springdale as you try to find an exit to escape, all the while collecting special treasures from chests that spawn in certain locations. It's definitely one of the more memorable parts of the series. Getting back to the main story, and spoiler warning if you haven't yet beaten the first game, you can skip ahead to this timestamp on screen. The protagonist and Whisperer learn that the evil chairman Squidward McCracken is trying to take over both the human and yokai worlds with his army, and so you go about trying to stop him from doing so, culminating in an extremely epic final showdown near the Gashapon at the start of the game. With the power of all of the yokai friends they met along the way, they're able to defeat McCracken once and for all. Unfortunately, in order to completely end the conflict, the two worlds must be separated for a time with the use of a talisman, and so the protagonist must temporarily part ways with all of his friends. However, they'll never forget the memories they made together, memories that will surely last a lifetime. Thus concludes Yokai Watch 1. Overall, it's just a really solid entry that lays the foundation for the rest of the series. The plot is admittedly a bit basic, and the true story doesn't actually start to unfold until the later chapters, which leads to a bit of a lore dump at the end that's a bit jarring, but it's still really creative and endearing, and the ending is genuinely heart-wrenching and is easily one of the best and most emotional moments in the series. The characters, especially the yokai themselves, are very charming and memorable. The battle system is novel and unique, and boss battles are truly a treat that really make use of the mechanics. It's pretty great, and I feel it holds up on its own alongside the sequels, even if it is extremely lacking in mechanics that became staples later on. And then came the sequel, Yokai Watch 2. Unlike the first game, this game has two separate versions, Ganso and Hokkei, localized as Bony Spirits and Fleshy Souls, and a deluxe edition called Shinichi, or Psychic Spectres, almost like a third version. I personally played Psychic Spectre, so I'm not exactly sure how much the base game differs between the three, aside from some new content, characters, quests, and post-game content. And I have to say, it was an interesting experience. Not necessarily a bad one, mind you, but just one that was a somewhat large tonal shift from the first game, going for a more overall comedic tone to appeal to fans of the anime that was airing at the time, which was extremely popular, and part of the reason why a lot of people got into the series in the first place, including me, though I'll touch on that later on. This is pretty evident through the change in character dynamics, pacing at the beginning, and a lack of obvious references to the first game. In this game, rather than focusing on the dynamic of just Nate, or Katie, the female avatar, and Whisper and how they encounter various yokai, Jibanyan also gets a major role as another protagonist. I'm fine with this change, but I vastly prefer the trio's dynamic in Yokai Watch 3 and 4. Here, the trio just feels like their weakest. That's not to say that they don't have charming dialogue, it's just that they have a lot more moments where they're really annoying compared to those games. Although those games also have their fair share of those types of moments. In the first game, Whisper was an eccentric and charming yokai butler who was extremely helpful for his interpersonal skills and was really kind and helpful to others, having a lot of moments where he truly stole the show. In Yokai Watch 2, he's a lot more whimsical and arrogant, and pretty much just becomes a punching bag for the characters to wail on, exactly like the anime. Jibanyan in the first game had a touching backstory, a great likable personality, and was a major ally in Nate's adventures. But here, he just feels annoying and lazy and not very likable at all. Later games definitely improved his characterization and writing. Not to mention Nate, who, while maintaining most of the same characterization, feels a lot ruder at points, although that's probably just for the sake of comedy. Overall, the characters definitely feel like they're worse in the series, but they still have really charming writing and interactions. The plot also got a major overhaul. Rather than having separate stories in each chapter like in the first game, this game has an overarching plot, where you aim to take down the Wicked Yokai, led by the 7 Wicked Generals, two evil sisters, Kin and Jin, and their psychic Bronzelo, if you have psychic specters, and their leader, Dame Deadtime, who aims to submerge the world in darkness and hate. At the start of the game, Kin and Jin make the protagonist's watch disappear, and they end up forgetting the events of the first game. After stumbling upon a mysterious shop and rediscovering the watch, you find both Whisper and Jibanyan again, and resume life as normal, with the first two chapters mainly being about setting up the world and its characters again, which does drag the pacing in the beginning by quite a bit. One thing I find odd is that despite referencing the events of the first game when meeting Jibanyan and Whisper again, there's a lack of references when meeting other characters. For example, you meet the watch shop owner again, but both him and the protagonist act as if they had never met before, which directly conflicts with the first game, where there's a whole scenario centered around him. This is also the same with several of the major yokai that the protagonist met in the last game, like Koma-san, Baku, etc. This is especially weird, as the developers could have easily remedied this by just having Nate say a quick throwaway line like, "Baku, is that you?" or "A long time no see, Koma-san," which wouldn't really alienate newcomers all that much. In fact, it probably would help them by letting them know that the two had met before. I don't know, perhaps I'm just scrutinizing a bit too much. The plot really picks up when a mysterious yokai who is making objects big, Meganyan, encounters the protagonist, saying something about how they could be the one, and urges them to travel to the city of Harrisville to learn more. Fortunately, their grandma happens to reside in the city, so the trio of Nate/Katie, Whisper, and Jibanyan travel to Harrisville. And before I continue with this plot summary, can I just say that Harrisville is absolutely beautiful. It's easily one of my favorite fictional locations, with its rural countryside vibes, relaxing music, and nature-filled environments. I would love to see this town recreated in the new engine for Yokai Watch 4. It would look absolutely amazing. Anyways, when they get there, they end up meeting this mysterious yokai again, who is actually revealed to be Hovernyan, a cat yokai who ends up becoming a major mascot of the franchise, frequently reappearing in subsequent games. He's also a favorite of mine. I really like his cool and courageous personality, his ultimate move, and overall design. He's pretty awesome. Honestly, if Magalore wasn't already my channel mascot, he would probably be next in line. Hovernyan explains that he's been waiting 60 years for someone who can help his friend defeat the evil wicked yokai, revealing that this friend of his is none other than the protagonist's grandfather, Nathaniel, or Kenny if you played as Katie, who also happens to be the inventor of the Yokai Watch. In order to help Nathaniel, Hovernyan uses a time stone which he had stolen from the wicked in order to transport everyone 60 years into the past, to help Nathaniel invent the Yokai Watch Model Zero and stop the takeover of the wicked yokai. This new model of the watch also provides more options for combat. By pressing the watch face in the middle of the bottom screen, you can switch back and forth between the original system of the OG Yokai Watch, like the one from the first game, and the system of the Model Zero, which allows you to use Moxie skills and poke enemies. Poking enemies replaces the target feature and allows you to glean various benefits from inspirited foes by poking them in different spots to either do damage, increase the money earned from battle, increase their befriending rate, and much more. Moxie skills replace ultimates and allow you to perform an even stronger version of this ultimate move with increased effects. However, this does come at the cost of wasting the soul meter of two adjacent yokai as well. To be honest, these two additions don't really add much to the overall gameplay style, as poking can only be done when enemies are inspirited, and Moxie skills are pretty suboptimal, as the same 3 soul meters used for one stronger Moxie skill can be used to perform 3 different ultimates, each with different effects and damage output, making the latter more valuable. However, I do appreciate their inclusion. Even if the combat is mostly the same as the first game, I don't really mind it that much. You know what they say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. As far as the plot goes, I'd honestly consider it to be easily the weakest part of the game. I love the fact that it's just one big adventure instead of the episodic nature of the first game, although I still love that style as well, and I especially appreciated the fact that the villains had more screen time, rather than just randomly appearing at the end like in the first game's finale. While not giving them any depth per se, it certainly allowed for their personalities to be fleshed out and made them more memorable for me. However, the plot itself is just fine. It's not bad, but it's not one that was memorable or one that I was invested in. I also didn't really like the new characters all that much. The only ones that really stood out to me were Hovernyan and Master Nyata, a typical master character who appears later in the game. The grandfather Nathaniel/Kenny was written as a typical edgy kid who thinks that he doesn't need friends, but soon learns about the power of friendship and becomes friendly again. His arc is really predictable, and he's really annoying for most of his edgy teen phase, except when he actually beats up the Wicked with the literal bat. That was pretty cool. The Bonies and the Fleshies, opposing yokai factions that are a major part of the game, were pretty cool, and I love the individual yokai that make up each faction, but as a plot device, it falls pretty flat with predictable arcs of teamwork. And while I did say I enjoyed the villains, there is a limit to that enjoyment, especially with Kin, Jin, and Bronzelo being really annoying characters. The rest are pretty great and memorable though. While combat is mainly the same, Yokai Watch 2 also has a plethora of new features outside of battle. For example, you can find various baffle boards around town with your Yokai Watch, and by summoning the appropriate yokai that the board describes through a riddle, you're able to affect the town through their own spirits to cause various effects depending on the battle board. There are also Gates of Whimsy, introduced to you by the particularly spunky character of Diana Gately, who's a personal favorite of mine, which you can find with your watch around town, and by entering them and participating in a random event, either battling a set number of yokai or solving a breakout room type puzzle, you're able to get Gate Globes, which you can give to Diana Gately to access a secret boss. A new mechanic branching off of the fusion mechanic from the previous game is Sorcery. By selecting a yokai to sacrifice themselves and turn into a soul gem. Yeah, I know that sounds horrifying, just don't think about it. Another yokai can equip that soul gem to claim effects like increased strength or health, depending on the soul gem equipped. Soul gems can even be fused with items to become even more powerful and provide even stronger effects. Although I haven't personally used it, which is partially because I've yet to understand how to use it properly, I think it's a really cool mechanic that's become a staple of the series. But there is one thing about this game, one thing that stood out amongst the rest. A villain so fearful that almost every review spoke of its name in dread, and made many people cautious and wary. A villain more powerful than even the Wicked, that could make even the most open-minded player feel intense frustration after only being subjected slightly to its long and dreary nature. A villain that went by the name of the Key Quest. If you aren't aware what a Key Quest is, it's essentially a type of side quests, which are typically optional mini-adventures you go on in most adventures, that is made mandatory in order to progress the story. You typically have to complete around 3, but you're able to do them in any order. The worst ones are when you have to walk all across the world just to fetch an item that a single character needed for a pretty stupid reason, although these are rarely common. Before buying this game, I made sure that I was ready and up to the task, my imaginary stylus in hand, shaking his fear as I drowned in sweat. I loaded the game and I was totally fine. Yeah, I don't really see why people complain about these things. If people were annoyed about the repetitiveness, I would totally understand. They can sometimes feel like they interrupt the flow of the story just when it's about to get really interesting. And the repetitive dialogue that can occur can be a bit grating. I can almost always predict that a character is going to say something like, "I can do that for you, but I need this random item first." However, people actually complain about how long and arduous they are, which is pretty odd to me. Somewhat early on in the game, a bit after you get to Harrisville, you unlock the fast travel system of Mirapo, mirror yokai who allow you to travel from one Mirapo in one area to another Mirapo in a completely separate area, alongside Mirror Docks, who allows you to travel back and forth between past and present. These two make it super fast to travel from one location in the past to a completely separate location in the present, so I rarely had a problem completing the key quest. That's not to say that they were awesome, but I still think they're just okay, but I definitely didn't have as much of a problem as a lot of people did. I think that's pretty much it for my thoughts on the main campaign. Before we wrap up this section, I'd like to quickly discuss some of the new content in Psychic Spectres. This third definitive edition added quite a lot of new content, including the Gara Resort, new bosses, new quests and favors, and even 3 full-on side stories that reveal the backstories of Dark Neon, Dame Deadtime, and even Whisper. And I have to say, I absolutely loved all 3 of them. This is the type of stuff that I would be ecstatic to see more of in future installments. Dark Neon was absolutely charming, and I loved the various Batman parodies that were scattered throughout. Dame Deadtime was actually surprisingly depressing, and gave a lot of humanity to this seemingly two-dimensional villain. But Whispers had to be the best of them all. There was so much care and production value put into this one, that it not only gets its own opening credit sequence, but had to be separated into 3 different quests, and the story itself is genuinely both heartfelt and heartbreaking, otherwise I won't spoil it here. I do feel that the Psychic Spectres version wasn't really necessary, as the main game isn't changed all too much. It's just new quests, extra bosses, and more side game content that was added. Also, internet updates were a thing in 2014, so the extra content could have just been distributed as a paid DLC, rather than having to pay for the same game again just to access this content. What's even weirder is the fact that you can actually transfer save data from the base games to this version, making it even more redundant. However, this is a good deal for those that missed out on the originals, as it contains everything in one solid package. Overall, Yokai Watch 2 is a really solid entry into the series. They have definitely improved mechanical in the first game, while adding a lot more unique and exciting content to make it an even better package, some of which I didn't even get to talk about in this section. The plot and characterization at points doesn't really do it for me, but the gameplay, locations, post-game, and other side content more than makes up for all of its shortcomings in my opinion. But enough negativity, for the next game in this retrospective is none other than the third and one of my personal favorite entries in this franchise, Yokai Watch Blasters. Yeah, you were probably expecting me to say 3, but nope, it's this one. Yokai Watch Blasters is a spin-off of the mainline Yokai Watch series, akin to the likes of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, where you actually get to play as the yokai themselves. However, unlike that series, where the gameplay is more of a real-time strategy, this is more of a real-time action game, playing a lot closer to something like Monster Hunter. This game is also an expanded version / sequel to the Yokai Watch Blasters minigame found in Yokai Watch 2, which I didn't really touch on in that section, since it's more or less the same, if not better here. The story is pretty simple. The Yokai Watch Blasters are an organization split into different teams, which is dedicated to protecting the weak from evil and dangerous yokai, namely during terror time. However, one group, nicknamed the Bottom of the Barrel Blasters, completely fails at doing this until the yokai Sergeant Burley appoints himself as their leader to help put them into shape. Throughout the game, you go to various Yokai Watch series locations and help their inhabitants in order to upgrade from 0 to hero. Unlike the previous mainline titles discussed earlier, this game actually doesn't feature any of the human characters. Instead, it focuses on developing the already outstanding cast of yokai, including the snarky and charming Whisper, whose rank of awesomeness goes up a tier due to him being the driver of the signature Blasters mobile, the lazy Banyan, the energetic Sergeant Burley, the laid-back part-timer Blazaria, and many more. While the story is simple and there really isn't too much of an overarching plot, the witty banter and charming dialogue between each of the characters helps to keep players engaged, similar to the first game. The main hub for this game is known as the Blaster's House. On each floor, you can talk to various helping hands to manage your team before moving out on these missions. On one floor, you can talk to Naked Speed, Boss Sagnaton, and Dimmy to level up your team members and buy equipment. Another lets you access the Crank-a-kai, or like in the other games, you can get exclusive items and yokai. The basement allows you to battle teams of players you encounter with Street Pass. Talking to Sergeant Burley on another floor allows you to move out on various missions. Finally, talking to Happy Ear on another floor allows you to choose your move-out members. Unlike the previous games where 6 yokai comprised a party, only 4 can move out together. Each yokai has 4 moves: a basic attack, a technique, a power attack, and a ultimate move. Similarly to the mainline games, except the power attack replaces the spirit move. They're also classified into various roles: attackers, who focus on offense; tanks, who focus on defense and soaking up damage; healers, who focus on restoring health; and rangers, who focus on attacking from a distance. The addition of these roles being placed on each yokai helps to exemplify the team-building aspect I was talking about earlier, which is always great to see. The best team is usually composed of members of all 4 roles, or those who can easily cover each other's weaknesses. This is all just talk though. These tactics are actually reinforced through the gameplay, and the game forces you to adopt a different mindset from what you may have already been trying before, through roadblocks that may encourage switching tactics. Speaking of which, let's actually talk about the gameplay. The game has 3 main modes: Patrol Mode, Story Mode, and Big Boss Mode. The Story Mode is divided into multiple chapters, just like the mainline games. In each chapter, you'll travel to a different location and get involved in a different wacky scenario involving a different cast of characters. Each chapter is also divided into multiple missions, in a very similar manner to Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon, where you traverse the same map each mission, but have differing objectives each time. Each chapter also ends in a thrilling boss battle against a powerful foe. These fights are the absolute highlight of the game, keeping you engaged and on the edge of your seat, as you have to really analyze the boss's attack patterns to find and take advantage of their weak spot. They're extremely fun, and honestly some of the best boss fights I've ever experienced. In the patrol mode, you're able to free roam any of the locations you've visited in the story thus far, and participate in mini missions to gain extra Oni orbs, which I'll get to in a second. This mode is also a great way to befriend yokai. After defeating a yokai, there's a chance that a friend circle will appear. By completing a short rhythm game, you'll be able to befriend that yokai and play as them. This system is a bit clunky compared to the previous befriending systems, and as a result, makes it pretty difficult to befriend yokai. I'd definitely say it's one of the downsides of the game in my opinion. Finally, the Big Boss mode allows you to rematch bosses from the main story, as well as take on their stronger Super and Ultra forms for awesome rewards. This is one of my personal favorite aspects of the game, as the boss battles are a major reason why Blasters is one of my favorite Yokai Watch games. As I've hinted to earlier, after partaking in a given mode, you earn Oni Orbs, this game's collectible. These are used for most of the facilities in the Blaster's house, such as using the Crank-a-kai, buying equipment and items, and even leveling up your various yokai. I think they're a fun collectible to grind, and for whatever reason, it feels really satisfying whenever you use them at these facilities. Before I wrap up this section, I'd like to briefly mention two major components of the game, the first being the addition of online. I neglected to mention this in the previous section, but Yokai Watch 2 added online for the first time, allowing for online and local 1v1 battles, trading, as well as local cooperative play in the Yokai Watch Blaster side mode. Here, however, in addition to those features, there is also full online cooperative play, where you can team up with 3 friends to take on some challenging bosses. I haven't actually tried it myself yet, so I don't know the specifics, but from what I've heard, it seems to be a very fun experience. The second is the free DLC expansion Moon Rabbit Crew, which includes 2 brand new chapters, one in which the Blasters partake in spacefaring missions, and another in which they have to restore the balance between the human and yokai worlds. It includes new yokai to befriend, new bosses to battle, and much more, making the game an even more awesome package than it already is. Overall, Yokai Watch Blasters is an extremely good game, and one of my favorite Yokai Watch games. It is simple but addictively fun gameplay, charming character interactions and witty dialogue, tough and engaging boss battles, and much more. The gameplay can be a bit tedious at times, and the story isn't anything great, but the other aspects more than make up for it. It's pretty awesome. But this next game somehow manages to be even better than Blasters, and is what I personally consider to be the peak of the game series. Ladies and gentlemen, introducing Yokai Watch 3. Where do I even begin? Well, let's take a look at the story first. The game's story serves as a nice middle ground between the format of 1 and 2, where there are plenty of individual stories that nicely build up into an epic climax. I really like this because it avoids the pitfalls of 1, where the climax feels very sudden, but also the pitfalls of 2, where the climax is built up and pretty epic to boot, but the rest of the story feels really dry. This ends up being a really nice fusion that addresses each format's weaknesses with the other's strength. In this game, Nate's story revolves around him moving to America, or BBQ in the English localization, and encountering the various yokai that live there. He ends up encountering and befriending this kid named Buck, who is also able to see yokai, although he thinks they're aliens, due to the power of the shard and a necklace he wears. Together, the two explore BBQ and end up getting into tons of Huckleberry Finn-esque adventures, which mainly turn out to be caused by pesky yokai at the end, including discovering the truth behind the mysterious UFO that crash landed one day. But that's just Nate's story. You see, in this game, we're also introduced to a brand new protagonist, Haley Ann Thomas, who also lives in Springdale. Haley is essentially a geek who loves all things anime and sci-fi and is extremely hyperactive. One day, a mysterious yokai named Usapion seeks her out and gives her a yokai watch, in order for her to help him find his caretaker when he was alive, Dr. Huey. When he was alive, Usapion was an otter named Danny who was stuck in a foster pen with a bunch of rabbits, and as a result was discriminated against. That is, until Dr. Huey took him under his wing, showing him the wonder of outer space and rocketry, leading Danny to form a strong familial bond with Dr. Huey. However, during a test lift-off with Danny as a passenger on the rocket, Danny accidentally destroyed the rocket and in the process killed himself, leading to him becoming a yokai and Dr. Huey losing all hope in his profession. In order to try and find Dr. Huey in order to apologize for the accident, Usapion tried to find the legendary yokai master Nate to help him, However, Nate had already moved to BPQ, so he settled on Haley instead, resulting in the start of a quirky duo. The first chapter of Haley and Usapian's story is dedicated to tying up these loose ends and motivating Dr. Hughie to chase his dreams once again. After seeing how well they work together, the two then decide to open up a detective agency, where they solve cases surrounding yokai together. In the following chapters, the two tackle big cases and try to help their clients as best as they can. I think both stories are equally great in their own way, being very creative, with fun story beats and dialogue. I do think that Nate's is better due to it being set in a new location, but Haley's does have some strong points. I especially love how the story eventually combines both of them, leading to some even more epic final chapters. Some do critique the story for being too simple and not too deep, but I really don't mind, for as much as it may be lacking in those aspects, it more than makes up for it with its extreme creativity. For example, in one chapter you'll be exploring a zombie-filled supermarket at night, and the next you'll be fighting a giant kaiju monster. There is no limit when it comes to ideas in this game. I think another reason why this works so well is because of the excellent characters and naturally witty dialogue. Jibanyan and Whisper are mostly the same, except way less annoying. Usapian is awesome, and I love his design, accent, and sass, as well as how he's a great foil to Haley and her equally charming energy and positivity. Buck is also the same. He has a great dynamic with Nate and works much better as a partner character than Nathaniel from the last game. He should really return more often. And speaking of the man himself, Nate. I just want to thank Level 5 for making this absolute god tier character. Yokai Watch 3 Nate is easily the best incarnation of Nate, aside from OG anime Nate, which we'll touch on in a bit, having the same traits as the others, but with just the right touch of sass, swagger, and cool factor. Related to characters, there are a bunch of new yokai introduced in this game, including some called American yokai, who are American. Some people complain about the fact that they're mainly based on American stereotypes rather than urban myths, and in general stray away from the series' roots in Japanese mythology. They tend to also slander the whole yokai roster of 3, and even the game itself just because of these designs. And honestly, I somewhat disagree. While it was a missed opportunity to not get those, I'm still very happy with what we got. I mean, have you seen O'Wheel, Hot Air Buffoon, I'm a Genius, Salty Bacon? These are perfect designs. Speaking of meat, it's time to talk about one of the core aspects of the game. The gameplay, of course. Overworld mechanics are pretty much the same as the previous games, but one special thing I would like to note is that the dungeon design is top tier. I won't spoil anything, but I will say that it is so good in the way that it takes previously established mechanics and recontextualizes them in unique and fun ways that absolutely blow my mind sometimes. I really think that more games should use this in order to create more standout, innovative experiences. Speaking of experiences, let's finally talk about the most important aspect of the gameplay, the battles. Yokai Watch 3 changed the battle system from 1 and 2 by turning the yokai wheel into a 3x3 grid. This added an extra layer of depth by allowing you to position your yokai for various tactical advantages, such as placing a yokai in front of another to block damage being dealt to that yokai. Ultimates were also readjusted to now have a predefined range. They wouldn't just automatically hit every enemy on the field. This allowed the yokai to avoid powerful opposing ultimates, which was especially helpful for bosses. However, a cooldown occurs every time a yokai moves, meaning that they can't be moved all over the place throughout battle. This also applies to switching, so yokai can't be swapped out all willy-nilly. The same applies to the enemies too. Enemies were also able to move, and were now capable of even dodging ultimates. Now you may think that this would completely nullify ultimates, but it actually didn't, thanks to the powerful technique that I call Ultimate Juking! This enlightened technique involves you using one yokai's ultimate to make the enemies move out of that move's range, but then quickly cancel and switch to another yokai's ultimate to hit them while they're unable to move due to their cooldown. This is an extremely fun mechanic that, intentionally or not, really increases the amount of strategy in battle. This also applies to the battle system as a whole. While I love the wheel, I personally feel that the grid adds a whole new dimension to combat, and makes it that much more complex and interesting in regards to tribe unities, yokai placement, ultimates, etc. Combat is optimized even further through the use of new mechanics, such as ultimate floor effects for specific yokai, spirit and life orbs that are distributed throughout battle, the Build-A-Nyan mode, which allows you to create your own cat yokai using accessories found while exploring the overworld, and the skills and techniques of feline yokai you befriended, and most importantly, the T-Trove items from the Kovian continent in the Blaster's T mode. Speaking of which, let's quickly discuss Blaster's T. Just like the Blaster's mode from Yokai Watch 2, Yokai Watch 3 has its own Blaster's side mode called Blaster's T. Taking inspiration from the themes of discovering treasure in the base game, this mode is more of a dungeon crawler where you collect valuable T-Trove treasures, but with the familiar Blaster's battle system. As mentioned earlier, these items, once acquired, can be used in the base game for some absolutely powerful effects, such as the Forbidden Fruit, which allows you to automatically befriend any yokai you throw it at. I'm not really good at dungeon crawlers, so my opinion on this mode is negatively biased, but I will admit that it's a fun game with a pretty substantial amount of content. And in summary, that's pretty much what this game is. Just an absolute joyride filled with funny gags and laughs, an interesting and strategic battle system, memorable characters and experiences, and much more. Sure, it does have its flaws, like the amount of meaningless boss rematches. Seriously, why do you have to fight this guy like 4 times? But its pros far outweigh the flaws, and make it one of, if not my favorite 3DS game of all time. For the sake of completeness, I included these two in this retrospective despite them both being Japanese exclusives I know barely anything about, so this section will be pretty short. The first of these, Sengokushi, released in 2016, is a collaboration with Koei Tecmo's Romance of the Three Kingdoms franchise, and starred Yokai Watch's main characters parodying various Three Kingdoms characters. The game seems to play like a Fire Emblem strategy game, with different characters as different units, but with classic Yokai Watch elements, including the returning Cricket Hive. I'm not sure what the story is like, but it seems to be pretty in-depth this time around, with the game being really dialogue-heavy compared to other entries, with not as much as focus on exploration, which I suppose is understandable. The second, Blasters 2, is a sequel to the first Yokai Watch Blasters game covered previously, except this time taking inspiration from the Blasters T mode from Yokai Watch 3, with the gameplay pretty much being the same as its side mode counterpart. What's different from both source materials, though, is the fact that this game has an actual story, with new original characters, villains, and more. It even has a pretty cool opening cutscene that's arguably one of the series' best. I don't know all too much about it, aside from it revolving around possession, evil genies, and lots of treasure, but I don't really know the specific details. Overall, they both seem like fun games that I'd be down to check out, even though they will never be localized, except if they get a newer console port and a localization, but that's a bit of a pipe dream. Now before we talk about the next game in this retrospective, let's take a moment to talk about another, and perhaps arguably the greatest aspect of the franchise, the anime. The Yokai Watch anime was a major factor in the series' initial success in Japan, causing increasing merchandise and game sales. It was extremely appealing to a wide demographic, and helped introduce casual observers into the franchise. I suspect that the primary reason for this was due to the anime's format. Unlike a lot of other anime, where the series follows a protagonist and a group of friends going on an adventure, this anime is a comedy. And honestly, this fits surprisingly well. I'm not sure if I mentioned this in the previous sections, but Yokai Watch is funny, sometimes downright hilarious at times, so adapting the games to be a comedic anime is actually a great idea in retrospect. The comedy of the average Yokai Watch season can be represented by this shadowly made diagram that I totally didn't create. The two axes at the top represent the variables of hilarity and weirdness respectively, and each quadrant represents the result of the combination of varying values of each axis, like your typical graph. Comedy that isn't weird at all, but isn't too funny either, lands in the simplistic comedy category. This is material like, why did the chicken cross the road? To get the other side. Yeah, it's not really that funny. Maybe some jokes will get a chuckle, but most aren't really laugh-worthy. On the other hand, comedy that isn't weird, but incredibly funny, lands in the hilarious jokes quadrant. These are absolute gut-busters that'll keep you laughing, and Yokai Watch has quite a few of these. However, comedy that isn't really funny, but is also incredibly weird, belongs in the cringe/disturbing category. These are jokes that are somewhat repulsive, either in the sense that they're incredibly awkward, or that the jokes are, well, disturbing. Yeah, we'll get to it in a second. Finally, we have the unconventional humor category, which is a bit of a mouthful. This essentially is humor that's like the previous category, except also pretty funny. This is one aspect that I feel that Yokai Watch excels at, or the original series at least. Each season usually has a different combination of these aspects, some of which make or break it in my opinion. But now, let's finally get to the episodes themselves. The original Yokai Watch anime lasted for around 214 episodes, divided into 4 seasons, airing from 2014 to 2017. In the first episode, Nate accidentally frees Whisper from the Crank-a-kai, like in the games, who gives him the Yokai Watch to solve a yokai inspiriting problem at home. Later, he meets Jibanyan, and together they meet and befriend various yokai throughout the series. Each episode is divided into multiple segments. In the main segments, Nate will encounter strange occurrences, declare it's a yokai's fault, Whisper will disagree with him, Nate will find a yokai, Whisper will try and find their name on his yokai pad while giving him multiple guesses as to their name, then find what they're called and explain what they do. Nate will summon Jibanyan, who in most scenarios is unable to deal with them, and ends up being inspirited, which will showcase the yokai's effects, and then Nate will summon other yokai and defeat the enemy yokai. If you thought that was incredibly specific, that's because the main segments are incredibly formulaic, aside from the actual comedy that plays out in terms of the dialogue and gags the characters go through. Although, there is a big factor which does help to reduce the monotony, that being the summoning songs. When Nate summons a yokai using his watch, a quick little song will play while the yokai does some summoning poses. These songs vary depending on the tribe of the yokai summoned, and while incredibly short, they are insanely catchy, and one of the most beloved aspects of the franchise. So much so that there are actual yokai watches you can buy with collectible medals that play these summoning songs depending on the medal you put in. It's actually really cool, and I've even bought a couple of them. Anyways, unlike the main segments, the side segments, however, are incredibly varied, each focusing on the antics of a certain yokai or a group of yokai, usually for the sake of comedy and parodying famous TV tropes, which when done right, is actually pretty hilarious. Season 1, in my opinion, isn't as great as I remembered. On a first watch through, the jokes were quite funny, but they quickly became stale over time, not to mention how cringy a lot of them were. The main running gag of the season is Nate being called average by all of his friends, including yokai ones, which was chuckle-worthy at first, but just seemed odd on a rewatch. One scene in particular with this gag stuck out to me. Nate and his 2 friends Eddie and Bear get their test scores back, and Eddie gets a 96, while Bear gets a 50 and Nate gets a 70. Nate is seemingly teased by both of them for getting a 70 on the test, which is supposedly an average grade, and something to be laughed at, while Bear, the one who got the lowest score, which is an E by the way, is barely mentioned and even joins in on the fun despite getting a lower score than Nate. It's moments like these where I think the use of this gag in this season is kind of overkill. In other seasons, the gag is either well deserved or actually serves a comedic purpose. Here, it just feels unnecessary, especially when Nate didn't really do anything to deserve being mentally bullied by his friends like this. The other childish humor, primarily the toilet humor, also feels forced and in some cases like the second episode, doesn't make sense at all. In that episode, the yokai Tattletale causes Katie to tell Nate's friends that he used the bathroom, which supposedly makes him a laughingstock of the school, which causes him to want to get revenge on Tattletale as the plot of the episode. It's an odd gag that doesn't really make sense to me, and dampens my enjoyment of a pretty great episode. Aside from the middling humor, the scenarios presented were also quite tame. Not saying they were bad, but relatively basic compared to later seasons, which are way more wacky and imaginative. I understand why, as this season was meant to introduce staple yokai like Blazion and Tattletale, who Nate will rely upon time and time again, but that doesn't mean I have to exactly like it. Finally, I'll be brutally honest, the side segments were pretty uninteresting. This season, they primarily revolve around 3 yokai, Manjimut, Koma-san, and Kyubi. The first, Manjimut, gets 2 segments. The first segment details Manjimut's efforts to get a job while trying to avoid his animalistic instincts. Unfortunately, this doesn't end well for him, and after being sent in and out of jail multiple times, he's essentially sent to Alcatraz, which is impossible to escape from. However, the second segment shows him doing just that, with the help of some human prison inmates he meets along the way. Each segment is split into several parts across multiple episodes. While the concepts were certainly interesting, I just wasn't really invested due to it being, well, about Mangy Mud. He's not the worst character, although he's certainly up there due to his obsessions, but not one I care about in the slightest. The second yokai, Koma-san, gets 3 segments. The first segment is about Koma-san meeting up with his brother Komajiro, and their adventures in the big city together, with Koma-san trying to impress Komajiro by showing him how easily he can conquer his challenges, while Komajiro is largely unfazed and instead enjoys the city experience, picking up its culture quickly along the way, leaving Koma-san a bit jealous. The second is about Koma-san working a job and moving up the ranks through weird and wacky circumstances. Finally, the third is about Koma-san getting the courage to confess his love to a girl he likes, with the help of Komajiro and Akaba Joe. My problem with these 3 segments is the exact opposite of Manjimuts. The characters of Koma-san and Komajiro are wholesome and charming, but the situations are pretty bland, and most of the comedy and jokes overstay their welcome and are pretty underwhelming. Although I can see a potential audience who might enjoy them, so I won't hold it against them. Last and certainly least, we have Kyubi, whose segment is all about getting Katie's love. I already thought Kyubi was kinda mid in season 1, but combining him with such a boring premise and average jokes just makes for a below average side segment that has the pitfalls of both of the previous ones discussed. Overall, season 1 was okay. It had an even spread of comedy throughout all 4 of its categories, both good and bad. It definitely had a long way to go to improve, but it wasn't all that bad. If the scenarios and humor were more imaginative and funny, I think this could have been a great season. Luckily, season 2 did just that, expanding on what made season 1 so special, while eliminating its flaws. First off, the comedy is just superb. Not only is there a lot less cringe, but the jokes are just hilarious, and the characters are really charming. When I think of pure zany Yokai Watch goodness, this is what I think of, along with the later seasons, but we'll get to those. A lot of the hashtag relatable child humor is eliminated in favor of more wacky and cartoony jokes that use the animated medium well. This season also introduced aspects with the new Yokai Watch Model Zero, which has a bevy of new flashy summonings, classic yokai from the games that we know and love, not to mention the classic yokai. It also has a ton of new side segments, which are all pretty fun, and a significant improvement over season 1's. All of these side segments are distinct and unique, with creative ideas and decent humor, and they're all able to maintain my interest throughout the season. Overall, season 2 is a great step from season 1 in most areas, and is just incredibly funny and charming. However, in my opinion, this season was just a taste of what was to come with season 3 and 4. At this point in this section, you probably noticed that I haven't talked much about the 3rd and 4th categories of that diagram I showed earlier, and that's because they don't really show up in the first couple seasons that much, aside from some select moments in season 1. Fortunately, Level 5 and OLM, the animation studio who produces the anime, seemed to notice that as well, and as a result, the anime had a major shift. First off, the art style and designs of the main characters changed to match Yokai Watch 3, which I really like, as it's pretty aesthetically pleasing. Speaking of that game, they also introduced the character of Hylian and her partner Usapion, and they get their own dedicated segments detailing their adventures helping Dr. Hyli, informing their detective agency, and solving actual cases which even explain certain yokai's backstories. In Season 4, they even introduced the character of Tomanian, one of the mascots of 3, and Jerry, an anime original character who hasn't appeared in the games at all, and has to be one of the most unhinged and funniest characters I've seen in the series. Speaking of comedy, the humor also changed drastically, featuring more gaggy and over-the-top humor rather than consistent broad-appeal jokes. Given how I criticized Season 1 for its overuse of these tropes, you would think that I would hate both of these seasons. However, that's exactly the opposite. I think these seasons are amazing for exactly that reason. I think my main gripe with Season 1 is that the jokes were gaggy, but relatively simple, so the over-the-topness felt like a fake pretense. Here, the characters feel very animated. Literally. While Nate in Season 1 and 2 felt more grounded in contrast to the absurd humor, in Season 3 and 4, Nate feels more cartoonish, which further accentuates the more cartoonish humor. The scenarios are also wildly imaginative, with more events taking place in the yokai world or using more fantastical elements, rather than being too grounded, which works well in favor of the comedy, making this the best Yokai Watch humor that I've seen in the series yet. The side segments are also really good. I liked how unique and creative each of them were. There are too many to list specifically, but I could not talk about the anime without mentioning two of my favorites in the entire anime's run, Komasan Taxi and Yokai New Series Conference. Komasan Taxi attempts to revisit the disturbing gags from prior episodes, or sometimes even right after them, and get the perpetrator in question to reform for their sinful actions. And before you ask, yes, this is real. It's an extremely creative concept, and very hilarious seeing the cute and charming Komainu, Komasan, and Komajiro deal with a very odd group of passengers. Except for Whisper, this man was unlawfully convicted just for asserting his superiority among yokai. Hashtag justice for Whisper. The second segment is another giant meta reference. In this segment, the characters have a board meeting to decide the latest side segment, with each major character giving their own pitch, and each of them parodying various TV genres, like action, medieval fantasy, family sitcom, romance, etc. They're also hilariously well done. I guess this is also a nice segue to talk about something that these two seasons, as well as the franchise in general, do well. References. There are so many references littered throughout the series that pay homage to various pop culture icons and franchises in such a way where it can feel really corny, but at the same time really fun. Just listing off the top of my head, the series parodies Mission Impossible, Star Wars, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Pokemon, Sailor Moon, Final Fantasy, Space Invaders, Journey to the West, Titanic, Attack on Titan, The X-Files, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, The Twilight Zone, and even itself in some episodes. Seasons 3 and 4 just absolutely smashed it out of the park, creating weird and wacky scenarios and hilarious jokes that have kept me laughing on each rewatch. I genuinely think that these two seasons have a unique level of comedy that no other Yokai Watch anime series has yet to match. But before we wrap up the section, I'd just like to briefly mention the related movies of the original series, The Secret of Birth, Lord Enma and the Five Tails, and The Flying Whale and the Double World. The first of the bunch is easily the worst. The Secret of Birth attempts to be a direct adaptation of the second game story, which, if you remember, I didn't really like, but cuts out all the interesting parts like the unique and memorable wicked generals, bony and fleshy war, etc., leaving a very bare-bones plot that couldn't really hold my interest. It also has the Season 1 style comedy, which I also didn't really like, as well as mediocre action sequences and a pretty mid-finale. Overall, it's not that great of a movie. It's fun seeing my favorite characters on the big screen, but other than that, it's pretty underwhelming. Lord Enma and the Five Tails, on the other hand, is an awesome movie. The movie is comprised of 4 vignettes, each detailing adventures of one of the major groups of characters, such as Nate and Whisper, Jibanyan, Shogunyan and Robanyan, Komasan and Komajiro, and Haley and Husapyan, as well as one final adventure where, along with Hovernyan, they all tried to convince the yokai chairman Zazzle to allow humans and yokai to intermingle again, after he puts forth a new law which threatens to separate the yokai and human worlds entirely. The first 4 vignettes all share a common theme of humans and yokai working together in harmony, which further strengthens our hero's conviction and helps convince the lord of the yokai world to help them win against Zazzle in the climax. This thematic and emotional storytelling of each of the stories was rather unexpected, given how comedic the actual anime itself is. Sure, there are plenty of jokes here, but they're pretty spread out, and the movie isn't too gaggy, which honestly, I really love. I wish we got more content like this in the actual anime itself. This would be really cool. Finally, the third movie, The Flying Whale and the Double World, is an interesting case. Rather than merely being just hand-drawn animation, it alternates between that style and a CGI live-action hybrid. This also serves as the plot, and no, I'm actually not kidding. Essentially, there's this giant whale yokai, which switches between these two styles, which are apparently different dimensions in this canon, so Nate and crew go to investigate, because this is causing a major issue in the relation between the dimensions. They find out that the cause of this whole ordeal was just an ordinary girl named Kanami Minami, who's a ballet dancer who broke both her legs in an accident. She was so spiteful about not being able to dance anymore that her strong desire caused the yokai to appear and bring her to the animated dimension, where she could freely dance as she wanted. That's actually a pretty tragic backstory for what this movie is. Her darkness soon overcomes her, and eventually Nate and crew have to fight her, and the new incarnation of her darkness called Narwhal, in its evolved form Whaleman, to save both the worlds from doom. The movie actually uses the gimmick of having both mediums pretty well, with Nate and crew using the yokai Koalnyan to switch between them to reach locations only in the CGI world, or take advantage of the laws of physics from the animated world. It's actually pretty neat. Overall, it's a pretty funny and charming movie, and while it's not as great as the second movie, it's a solid movie. Even if you don't like it, you'll at least find some laughs at seeing how dated it's become. And that wraps up the original Yokai Watch animated series. While it certainly has its lows, its cringe, and its disturbing moments, it can be a really fun time. It's kind of a shame that only 2 seasons were fully dubbed. I hope that the rest of the episodes make it to the West. But you're probably wondering, if the original Yokai Watch anime ended in 2017, then what happened in the anime from then till now? And that, my friends, leads us to our next topic of interest, Shadowside. After the original anime ended, rather than continuing to use the same world and formula, Level 5 decided to take the franchise in a bold new direction, with the Yokai Watch Shadowside sub-series, including the 4th Yokai Watch movie, Return of the Oni King, as well as a new anime series simply titled Yokai Watch Shadowside. Return of the Oni King primarily serves as an introduction for the anime's main cast and setting, although it can stand on its own as a singular adventure. The movie starts by giving some background exposition, explaining the world present in this movie is 30 years in the future from the original series, and that Nate has now lost his yokai connections due to him missing his yokai watch and becoming an adult. It then introduces us to Cole, a teenager who's recently been pretty depressed because his parents have been too busy to spend time with him. The villains of the movie, the Onimaru, prey on his emotional vulnerability to make him the leader of the Onimaru and wield the Keegan gear, which will allow him to cause a global pandemic. Did the writers just predict COVID-19? Anyways, they then show that any infected will then join his army to essentially take over and rule the world. With this exposition, we then switch over to the perspective of Bruno, a magic practicing kid who notices the dawn of the Onimaru invasion and tries to figure out a way to stop them, using the power of the legendary Yokai Watch, which he intends to track down with the Yokai Energy Radar. We then switch once again to our main character Summer's perspective. She's Nate's daughter, and she's just living an average middle school life, when she runs into Whisper and the Cricket Guy, in an extremely similar fashion to Nate when he was a kid. Whisper explains that he's been waiting an extremely long time to meet someone who's capable of wearing it, as it apparently has a specific chosen one in this iteration. Bruno ends up running into Summer and Whisper mentions that it is up to Summer to save the world from the Onimaru using the Yokai Watch. She doesn't accept though, and ends up giving it to Bruno, who rejects it immediately. After seeing her mom and brother get turned into Oni though, she changes her tune and decides to help. Throughout the movie, they team up with new and familiar faces, such as Slimamander, or Sly, Jibanyan, Komasan, QB, and more, to stop the Onimaru. Eventually, they all discover that Cole has now joined the dark side, and they try to remove him from the influence of the Keegan gear so he can return back to normal. After they purify him by healing his mental trauma, he joins up with them to defeat the resurrected Oni King, who is revived through the combination of a bunch of Onimaru. During the credits, we then see the trio join up together in order to form a yokai detective agency, which is meant to be a lead-in to the show. Overall, this movie is pretty good. The characters and dialogue are charming, the set pieces and action scenes are especially exciting, as they're quite different from what we're used to within Yokai Watch, and the story is actually really interesting and more mature, which is again, very different from the norm. The movie isn't perfect though, as it does have a multitude of, not necessarily plot holes, but odd writing choices. For example, throughout the movie, Bruno just has a bunch of yokai keystones that Summer can use to summon yokai with, seemingly just having them for plot convenience. I understand that this is a movie with world-ending stakes, so we can't just have a random subplot with finding yokai to help, but Bruno just having 3 keystones is a bit too much in my opinion. I think he should just have 1. The movie also ends awkwardly with Summer just casually using the power of social media to defeat the Oni King. I mean, if I went on Twitter and asked a bunch of people to help me defeat a villain like that, they'd probably defeat me instead. This is also really dumb given the fact that her friends are actually fighting using God's words of magic and she's just like, social media! Anyways, the movie was okay. Not my favorite of the quadrilogy, but a fun time nonetheless, but it definitely does not compare to what came after. As hinted at earlier, after this movie, Yokai Watch Shadowside got its own anime series, and it's probably one of my favorite pieces of Yokai Watch media. The series takes place right after the movie, and follows the trio of Cole, Bruno, and Summer, along with their yokai friends, who form a yokai detective agency and solve cases that appear on the internet. While this is a premise that has already been done before, with Haley segments in the previous anime, and will be done again later, this anime takes a more mature approach. Rather than yokai just causing simple mischief with their powers, the yokai actually inflict pain, both mental and physical, on humans. The trio of protagonists actually interview victims and witnesses, and use clues from their testimonies to seek out and defeat the enemy yokai. And when I say defeat, I don't just mean a wacky clash of personalities like the previous anime. No, there's actual fight scenes. They may sometimes be a tad bit on the short side, but fight scenes nonetheless. I didn't elaborate on this before as it's not really a core part of the movie, but this series features a brand new gimmick. Depending on which side of the keystone Summer turns in the watch, the yokai will turn into a different form, either light side or, well, shadow side. Light side is more of a mascot-like and docile form, while shadow side is more of a combat-ready and fighting form that takes great inspiration from the actual origins of each yokai. This is a clever mechanic, as the shadow side forms allow for the yokai to have more in-depth fight scenes, while they can still use the light side for scenes where the yokai are just chilling. But this series doesn't just stick with this approach and follow it in a formulaic format, it actually has a story. Throughout the series, the gang encounters Shuten Doji and his partner in crime, Doketsu. I don't exactly know what their English names are, as they haven't been localized yet. They hail from the Oni tribe, who used to rule the yokai world long ago. They're searching for the yokai holy swords, as well as the reincarnated form of their princess in the form of a human girl. By using the holy swords, they'll be able to resurrect their princess through this avatar, and together rule over the yokai world once more. The detective agency obviously doesn't want an evil princess ruling over the yokai world, so they set out to find the holy swords before the two Oni can, thus starting the story. This plotline is pretty subtle in the starting episodes, but it soon picks up and gets more focused as the episodes go on. While the plot does have a simple premise, it also does have quite a few twists and turns that I didn't expect, and a very satisfying climax where all of the characters have some part to play. Speaking of characters, let's talk about them, shall we? I think this cast of characters is probably my favorite Yokai Watch cast, aside from the OG, but I think they've been oversaturated a bit too much over time. Summer is very kind, but does have a short temper and a bit of attitude as well. I really like her. Bruno isn't my favorite, but he does have a very forward and charismatic personality, which I really like. Cole is definitely my favorite of the main trio. He's both very quiet and subdued, while also being a great fighter who contributes a lot to action scenes, with him being able to actually use the yokai holy swords. Summer's little brother, Tate, also becomes a part of the crew after getting involved in yokai affairs in some of the starting episodes. He's meant to be a parallel of Nate from the OG, and his wacky antics sometimes clash a little with the atmosphere, but I still think he's a fine addition, even if he's a tad annoying sometimes. There is also another new human protagonist, Isabelle, who gets introduced about halfway through the show. She's kinda just there. She doesn't really have an interesting personality or scene to shine in. Her only traits are that she's able to use magic like Bruno, and that Bruno has a crush on her, which aren't really developed at all. However, this doesn't really impact the show for me, since it's only one character, unlike another show I have to talk about later. Then we have the yokai. First, there's Whisper, who's essentially unchanged from his previous iterations, except this time he's more intelligent and competent, though not really combat-wise. Next we have Jibanyan, who is a complete role reversal from his original incarnation, and is now actually really tough and more mature, making it more logical that he's Summer's first choice when it comes to fighting yokai. Unlike with Nate, where Jibanyan just gets called almost every episode for practically no reason. Honestly, giving Jibanyan the voice of Kazuma Kiryu from Yakuza, and making him a complete edgelord was the perfect idea. Whoever thought of this definitely needs a raise. A version of Koma-san and Komajiro also appear in the series, but it's explained in Yokai Watch 4 that these guys aren't the same as the OG, just yokai with the same names. Koma-san is treated more like a wise old dog, while Komajiro is meant to be a cute comic relief, both of which are somewhat different from their original iterations. However, the brotherly bond between them is still present, despite them being of different species. We also have some new yokai characters in the series, Sly and Junior, who are both comic relief characters. I touched on Sly earlier, but this yokai is easily one of my favorites from Shadowside. He's really goofy yet serious at the same time, and he also has a penchant for being overdramatic at times, and I really like when characters are overdramatic. So yeah, peak character. I also should mention the fact that he also has his own ending song. I think that's enough said. Finally, we have Junior. Junior is a character introduced in episode 3 who is revealed to be Jibanyan's offspring, created from the remnants of skin that Jibanyan lost when he got shot in the gut. Yeah, let's not talk about that part. Anyways, Junior is now a baby who's just learning how to live, and his pure innocence comes across as very charming, combined with his bubbly personality and wacky antics with other characters. I really like him. These two characters really bring some of the charm and fun of the OG series into this new one, while not getting in the way of the tone of Shadowside. The comedy in the series is a lot more subdued compared to the OG's more bombastic and in-your-face gags. I find that this actually works with me, and I found myself laughing more frequently than with the OG, although not as hard all the time. Before I wrap up this section, I just wanted to address one thing. A lot of people seem to diss on Shadowside because it's apparently too edgy, dark, and/or scary. I heavily disagree with this point. Yes, I will not deny that Shadowside has a darker tone, literally. I mean, look at this color palette. But that doesn't mean that it is unnecessarily edgy. Just like with the comedy, the show is just mature and is unafraid to delve into more serious subject matter and plotlines, while at the same time still having wacky moments as well. Sure, it can have some potentially disturbing moments, but the OG had way more that were actually disturbing, not just theoretically. And about the designs, I'm sorry, but this is just not scary. This pales in comparison. It's more like one of those amusement park mascots compared to actual scary stuff from TV and film. Anyways, Yokai Watch Shadowside is definitely my favorite Yokai Watch anime. It has memorable characters, an interesting plotline, cool villains, charming dialogue and humor, and an epic climax. Everything that I've ever wanted from a story-based Yokai Watch show. After this show, I was really looking forward to what the next movies and anime had to offer, and this next piece really delivered. Introducing Yokai Watch Forever Friends, a prequel movie that takes place 60 years in the past, around the same time of the first Yokai Watch movie, in 1950s Tokyo. This adventure stars Jack Cobbler, a paperboy who was happily living with his mother in the city, using his earnings from his job to buy medicine to help his mother get better. One day, while they're about to sit for a meal, a strange aura takes over Jack's mother, and she wildly runs into the street, and gets run over by a car. This causes Jack to become very depressed, which soon leads to guilt over his mother's death consuming him, causing him to consider suicide. Wow, is that dark? When I sat down to watch this movie, this was an opening I could not expect from a mile away. It's very depressing and really sets the tone for the movie. Fortunately for our protagonist, before he can go through with it, he's stopped by a boy named Alistair, who manages to talk him out of it, even mentioning that his mother didn't die of natural causes. Instead, it was a yokai's fault. Jack questions how Alistair knows this, and he mentions that his sister suffered a similar fate. Now imbued with a goal and purpose, the two set out to find the yokai responsible. They end up encountering Tai, who spies on them during their plan, and reveals her natural affinity for seeing yokai and using magic. Seeing that she could be useful for their adventure, Alistair recruits her and the three start their journey. The three strategize at Alistair's mansion, where he reveals that the yokai behind the incidents is the evil yokai Tamamo no Mae, who essentially reaps women's souls. He proclaims that they will need the legendary Yokai Watch in order to summon other yokai to help defeat the enemy yokai. They then travel to the location where the watch is being stored and claim the watch after defeating its guardian. After being instructed on how to use the watch, they end up summoning 3 yokai using keystones Alistair already acquired, and begin their search for Tamamo and a way to get their family back. I won't spoil the rest of the story, as just with Shadowside, it's really well done, and there are great action sequences and emotional beats that had me mentally crying on my first watch through, and it deserves to be watched without spoilers. Overall, I really like this film. I don't have any strong thoughts, which is why this section is pretty short. The characters were well done. I thought Jack was a good protagonist. He had a good motivation and innocent personality, although there wasn't much for me to latch onto. Alistair was a major standout. I loved his fiery passion, his backstory and importance in the plot. He was really good. Ty was kinda just fine. She did have a solid story arc in the beginning, which I won't spoil, but after that she was just a part of the crew that contributed not much, besides cute character interactions. The yokai weren't as big of a part of this movie as I thought. None of them were really standout characters, except for the lovable furball Nekomata. I mean, how can you not love this guy? The biggest part of this movie was the animation. They really were able to capture the old-timey feel of the setting, and at points I even thought this movie looked like a modern Studio Ghibli film. The animation was so detailed. In conclusion, this movie is a really emotional and charming yokai watch film that any fan should watch. It's absolutely brimming with personality. Now I do have to put a disclaimer here. The following sections from here on out will contain negative opinions. If you are unable to tolerate these, I would highly suggest going to the timestamp on screen. I don't know why you wouldn't be able to tolerate them, but I guess some people will just be like that, and I respect your opinion. Anyways, starting with our least negative topic of the bunch, Yokai Watch 4. Finally, the first mainline game in a long time. I'm super excited to see how, it was kinda mid. Now before you throw me into a pit of lava Mario style, let me explain. First up, we have the story. It tries to bring in the elements of the Shadow Side and Forever Friends into the mainline canon, which I respect, but then it also tries to tie in the characters from the present timeline of the first three games, which I also respect. However, it does the latter in a way that feels forced and doesn't let them develop as much as I would like them to. One thing I will say is, when you have a giant crossover like this, it would have been cool if we had more interactions and dialogue between characters from different series about their similar/different experiences and background. There are some, but not nearly enough in my opinion, especially for someone like me who already experienced the media the story is based on and needs something of decent story value to appreciate. And if you think the original plot beats do just that, I'm sorry to say that they do not. Katie gets a watch. That's not a spoiler, by the way. The marketing already revealed that. But in the most stupid way possible that doesn't feel epic or emotional or faded in any way with others, it is the textbook definition of force. I understand the reasoning why they did this. For one, it says of the development of Nate and Katie's relationship over the following games to show that they have actual chemistry together, so it makes more overall sense that they get married before Shadowside. 2, it also makes up for the fact that Katie was demoted in 3 to being a side character and not a playable character alongside Nate, instead being replaced with Haley. Which, I mean, you could have just given the option to play as Nate or Katie alongside Haley, but I digress. Anyways, enough ranting about the story, let's talk about the elephant in the room, the gameplay. First, let's talk about the overworld gameplay. I was very disappointed. One of the most iconic elements of Yokai Watch that makes the game so special is not just the wacky scenarios and dialogue and characters, but the immersive world and abundance of things to do in it. 4 doesn't really have any of that world building, and just to be clear, size does not matter all too much for me. The world can be as small as a high school or as big as Hyrule. I don't care, as long as there are things to do or people to meet. The overworlds in 4 do look visually pleasing, but in terms of substance they are kinda lacking. There are some things to do, like finding Salamander markings and hidden treasures, which actually do make use of the fact that there's a 360-degree camera, but besides that, not much else. The map design is also quite constricted, which leads to areas not feeling as immersive or expansive as usual. Speaking of poor design, these dungeons were just not it. They were way too simple for me, and didn't really make as good use of mechanics as previous ones in the series did. The layouts were also pretty disappointing. I mean, the penultimate dungeon, not spoiling what it is literally a straight line. Overall, the overall gameplay is pretty underwhelming, and I really expected more, especially considering the fact that overworld traversal in this game is easily the best in the series, with slick UI, and the ability to travel to and fro pretty quickly with the use of a bike and Mirapo. Finally, the combat. Everywhere I see, everyone has been so excited that Yokai Watch has finally been going real time. even though it has had prominent elements of that in the past couple entries. But hey, who am I to complain? Let's see how awesome the combat in this new game is. It was mid. I'm sorry, but I don't really like the Yokai Watch 4 battle system all too much. It's certainly decent, but not too great. It primarily uses the Blaster's battle system, with each yokai attacking and using moves in real time. Now, you're probably thinking that I'm a hypocrite for liking the Yokai Blaster's battle system and not this one. However, in my opinion, the Blaster system works because it's more of a means to an end in order to accomplish various missions. Whenever it's used for direct combat, with the clear exception being made for boss battles, which add their own clever mechanics and difficulty, it comes off as boring and repetitive, which is exactly what 4 does. In 4, there's less movement in standard battles, and you're kind of stuck whacking enemies repeatedly until they're down. The boss battles are good. I would have appreciated more unique ways to strike them down, instead of the shared gimmick of using the new watch suction mechanic to drain and stun bosses. They should have had individual gimmicks. On top of playing as yokai, in 4 you can also play as the human characters, and it's honestly a mixed bag again. While I love playing as them, they don't really stand out too much from each other, and I only end up playing as 3 of them. Nate is an all-rounder, Summer is a healer who can also give defense buffs, Katie's a healer, Bruno is slow and somewhat powerful, and can use magic attacks, Jack is a zoner who uses some projectiles, as well as magic, and Cole is the powerhouse. The characters share archetypes, so they aren't as distinct from one another, and I end up just choosing the character with the better combination. For example, I chose Jack and Cole over Bruno because they're much faster and stronger respectively. I also played as Nate a lot because he's the OG protagonist. I didn't choose either of the girls because they just made the girls generic healers that didn't have much good attacking power, as well as the fact that you can now give allies food to heal them up every couple of minutes, making the healers somewhat irrelevant. This predicament wasn't present in Blasters because you only had limited items, making healers necessary for the team. Overall, the battle system in 4 was decent, but it could have been so much better if it were redesigned a little. Before we wrap up the section, I'd like to discuss one point of frustration for me. So, in the previous mainline games, yokai were befriended by tossing food at them, typically a kind and rarity that would have the largest befriending chance, and then hoping for the best. However, in this game, with the introduction of the Shadow Side yokai, that system is not applicable anymore. Now, in Yokai Watch 4, when you want to befriend a yokai you see in battle, you have to hope that the yokai will go into a capture-ready state after being defeated, and then you can tear out their soul. But that's not all. These souls, which are called Cone, come in 3 different varieties: gray, red, and gold, with each being an increasing rarity. To befriend a yokai, you will need to gather varying distributions of these Cone in order to clone them and befriend them. Yeah, this is kinda dark. I find that this process takes a lot longer than the previous food system, and can be really frustrating when you have bad luck. While the food system could potentially be annoying at some points, it definitely wasn't as frustrating as the Cone system. Overall, Yokai Watch 4 is fine. It's definitely not my favorite, but there were some redeeming aspects which I liked, such as the nice graphics and cutscenes, and UI. Level 5 did release an expanded version called 4++, which did add a lot of new yokai, new quests, a new mode, etc. But I wouldn't say that it changes my opinion, as it adds more content rather than fixing flaws that were already there. Around the same time that 4 released, a new Yokai Watch anime coincidentally released then. However, to my shock, it wasn't a Shadow Side Season 2, but rather a soft reboot that attempted to cater to nostalgia, called Yokai Watch ! Because that totally differentiates you from your predecessor. The worst part about this anime for me is that it didn't really try to do too much that was new. It did have a new watch with a new wacky gimmick, but that was more stuff befitting of Yokai Watch Season 5, not Season 1. The biggest story change is that Nate moves into to Katie, but that is really just used for some gags rather than actual character development. Other than that, as stated, it's just good old Yokai Watch, but with really drawn out and unfunny gags that are really reminiscent of the Season 1 humor I didn't like, but on steroids. The only other change was a slight format change. Now, there will be a new Koma-san Komajira segment in every episode. And to be honest, it was kind of bland. It did lead to the introduction of a new Toma family member, Kamami, who I think is really cute, but that really doesn't make up for it. The only positive things that stuck out to me in the show were the side segments, which all had creative concepts, albeit with decent execution. My favorite had to be a segment which had a fighting tournament, because it had actual fight scenes, although they were very gimmicky. Overall, this show just really didn't need to exist. They didn't try anything new with this one. It was just a rushed attempt to cater to nostalgia after the experiment of Shadowside, which is fitting considering the show is extremely short, with only 36 episodes. Well, at least they didn't make a disgusting sequel to the Lap It Up guy from Season 4. That was... After that travesty ended, Level 5 decided to introduce another brand new series in the same way like Shadowside, with its own brand new movie and show. This new series was called Yokai Watch Jam Yokai Academy Y, and it was something. This series stars a bunch of human versions of our favorite mascot yokai in a high school setting. In the series, they end up getting these watches called YSP watches, not yokai watches, which harness the yokai special power, or YSP, of various befriended yokai in order to summon them, and help them fuse with the wearer into powerful hero forms. There's some really snazzy transformation scenes. Throughout the series, these students use these hero forms to help protect the school and soon the world. The movie, called Can a Cat Be a Hero?, more serves as an introduction to the world and the characters rather than as a standalone adventure, so I won't discuss it in depth here. Just know that while I initially really didn't like the movie, due to me not adjusting to the style and tone all too well, I grew to love zany antics, fun characters and writing, and show-stopping action scenes. So then, for this section, we'll be focusing mainly on the show, and let me just say, it's almost the exact opposite of the movie, now that I think about it. First, the story. If I were to summarize the plot of the show, I'd say, a group of high schoolers use watches to fuse with the yokai to stop evil aliens from taking over the world. Now I know that's a loaded and somewhat vague sentence at the same time, but if you ask me to explain the plot beat some more, I'd have to just give you an in-depth recounting of every single episode. This is due to the plot having a lot of overlapping plot threads and beats to keep track of that fade in and out of relevancy among episodes, but not in such a way that it's impressive, but just really messy. For example, in around episode 28, they brought up an important plot thread revolving one of the focus characters, but then didn't address it in the next episode, and instead waited until not 35, not 40, but the 44th episode to address it, which at that point, I had lost all interest. There are also other issues with pacing too. A lot of episodes, especially in the first half, were really filler-esque, and it took until the second half for the plot to actually pick up, and even then, it was alright. I can't really say much else about the story without spoiling things, so I'll leave it at that. Next, the main hero cast. Now I see what Level 5 was trying to do here, create a memorable cast like Xenoblade 2 that fans will come to adore. You know, you have the childish and over-their-head protagonist, antagonist turning good, dramatic goofball. Oh wait, these are actually more similar than I thought. However, unlike said game, while I adore a lot of these characters for their personalities, their executions and arcs were kind of terrible. First, there's Jiba Jinpei, who's obviously a human to buy on. I loved his oblivious, upbeat personality in the movie, but in the show, they twist all these positive traits into negative ones, and make him unable to be emotionally competent and mature, which is really annoying in what are supposed to be very serious moments. Not to mention the fact that he gets way too much screen time in fights, and also gets the most hero forms out of the whole cast. He really prevents the others' abilities to shine. Next up are 4 characters with the same problem: Toma Sandyu, Fubuki Himekawa, Mira Raido, and Ryunosuke Kyubi. Their problem is that while they do have distinct personalities, they aren't really fleshed out as much as they deserve to be, and they are very overshadowed by the other focus characters. Speaking of which, next we have the 2 focus characters, at least in my opinion, Mataro and Ronto. The former is a regular student and becomes best friends with Jinpei, and is in love with superheroes. His arc is pretty good, with him learning what being a hero really means. However, it isn't entirely smooth, and doesn't get as much focus as it deserves. I think it's primarily due to the incoherent storytelling. There's also the major contradiction that Jinpei and crew just got watches and started doing hero stuff, with no training. while Motaro has to train for it for some reason, which I don't really understand, as they're just inserting metals into watches and playing PlayStation VR. I don't get it. The latter character is an antagonist turned protagonist. There are multiple problems with Ronto. One, his arc was more rushed than an assignment I had to finish half an hour before it was due. He acts like an antagonist for like 30 seconds, literally, then decides to consider using Junpei and gang as allies, and then becomes friends with them. 2, they spend a lot of time giving Ronto backstory through flashbacks, but don't bother constructing it into a cohesive motivation for Ronto in the story. For all of the PTSD and trauma that he went through as a child due to the aliens, they kind of just write it off as aliens evil. Speaking of traumatic backstories, we have the last character, Chiaki. Chiaki confronts the YSP gang in one episode, and after a decent fight scene, then reveals his extremely dark and depressing backstory, which I won't reveal as it's better if you see the scene for yourself. But then after that, he's treated like Ronto, and his backstory is just thrown to the wayside, and he just becomes a regular part of the crew, with his only purpose just being to look cool and have a cool hero form. I was really disappointed with the execution of his character. Overall, the hero characters just weren't done any justice at all. They really needed more development in order for them to actually stand out and fully embrace their personalities, but that just wasn't done. However, that can't be said for the... Hey, wait a second, am I forgetting someone? Oh, that's right, Nozu! I guess you can probably tell my problem with him. He's way too forgettable. He really just stands there in most scenes just to look intimidating, and serves barely any purpose at all. Poor guy. As I was saying, that can't be said for the villains. I think these are honestly some of my favorite Yokai Watch villains, and they have really distinct and lovable personalities. There's Nayu, the strategist alien commander, who has some pretty cool psychic powers, which aren't really expanded upon, but I digress. Then there's Elzamekia, who's this female idol who has magic powers and has a commanding social presence, making her a very strong dictator. Then finally, my two favorites, Dober and Meketeo. Dober is a really strong, cunning canine commander that is very ruthless, while Meketeo is an anti-hero that is more of a wily and tricky feline. I personally love Meketeo more, although Dober is objectively better due to Meketeo regressing over time. All in all, a great villain lineup. Finally, let's address the comedy. This series attempts to have more gaggy humor in line with the original series, which I feel doesn't mix well with the somewhat serious tone. In some scenes, it can be funny, but I feel like it really doesn't strike the balance between funny and serious that well at all, mainly due to Junpei's childish antics. I mean, in a scene where the gang was breaking into the villain's base, he was shouting and complaining about a pet rabbit. Really? That's not funny, it's just annoying. While in the first half of the season, there are a lot more of these unfunny, over-the-top gags, they do lessen it slightly in the second half, which is a good improvement, and I feel I did have a lot more chuckles in the second half. So in general, the humor is a mixed bag, and definitely not for me. Also, if I got $1 for every time someone was shown in their underpants, I'd probably have enough money to pay for 4 years of college tuition. And if I got a nickel for every time Junpei went naked and landed on top of Koma, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird it happened twice, and in back-to-back episodes. Before we wrap up discussion on Season 1, I would just like to talk about another major pet peeve I had, the fight scenes. Now, as I said earlier, they were awesome in the movie, being really dynamic with excellent animation. However, in the show, they weren't so great. The biggest problem with them is the fact that they're just so static. I'm not saying that the animation itself is bad, more so that the choreography is. All of the characters act as if they're in a turn-based RPG, and they slowly take turns doing actions. There's little to no dynamic action, like good fight scenes should be. This isn't helped by the fact that the show decides to pull a Kirby right back at you, and be like,
"How can I help you?"
Torihashi Neu.
Need a monster to claw with that there.
YSP.
Better get it with a money back guarantee.
In each episode, a person is usually possessed by darkness and turns into a generic-looking monster. However, unlike that show, where each monster has a different tactic that forces Kirby to use a new ability or tactic of his own, these are pretty much brain-dead, and the fight scenes don't vary too wildly, especially since Junpei takes up 95% of the screen time, which is a tad bit boring. Overall, Y Academy Season 1 was a bit of a mess. It did have some funny moments and emotional story beats, but ultimately the storytelling and characters were just not done the best, resulting in me not really being able to fully enjoy the show too much. But hey, just after Season 1 wrapped up, a Season 2 was announced. Maybe it'll be able to improve on the flaws of Season 1 and be much better. I really wish that Season 2 didn't exist. In order to not become a ranting mess, I'll just quickly summarize my thoughts. Just like Season 1, Season 2 also had storytelling problems, with it having way too much going on to have a coherent story to follow. This is especially harmed by the fact that the season was only 11 episodes, with 1 being filler, 1 being a training episode, 1 being just an introduction, and 1 being conclusion to the whole Y Academy saga. So that means that the writers had 7 episodes to address 2 plot lines and give multiple new characters a spotlight. Yeah, this was definitely rushed. The story just transitions from one plotline to the next, with no rhyme or reason. First, the YSP gang are trying not to get expelled for misconduct, which is an interesting premise, and then they're suddenly thrust into a new alien world of Atlantis, and help out despite having little to no emotional connection to the place. The writers should have just stuck to one plotline and just developed it across 25 to 30 episodes. That would have been so much better. This short runtime also means that the new characters have little to no development, and end up feeling very flat, with little to no personality. There's Lime, whose character is really unstable and shifts constantly. I couldn't really get a feel for who the character really is, and I didn't really like him. There's also Gomanda, whose primary character trait is that he's serious, Susano, who's honorable, and Alana, who's mysterious. These characters only have one trait, which makes them very forgettable, and it reduces my potential attachment towards them. This season also jumbled up the Yokai Watch timeline again, due to it now making Y Academy canon to the main timeline, with it showing that Jinpei is the granddaughter of Amy, the owner of Jabanyam when he was alive as a regular cat, meaning it is now confirmed to take place after Shadowside. However, in the Yokai Watch exclamation mark series, they also had an ending scene connecting to Y Academy, with the aliens attacking the yokai world, which just makes everything confusing. I honestly feel bad for new fans who want to catch up with anime and story now, as there's just a lot of material to get through, which all interlinks together, unlike the games, where they're mainly standalone and perfect for just jumping into. In conclusion, Y Academy Season 2 was even more of a disaster that had the same negatives of Season 1, with bad writing decisions and rushed storytelling, but with less amounts of enjoyable moments that made it really hard to like. Before we move on to our final section, I'd like to address the associated game that came out during the anime's run. Yokai Watch Jam, Yokai Academy Y, Yeah School Life. That's a mouthful. Apparently localized as Y School Heroes. I actually really like this game, for whatever amount of time I played it. Even though I've never actually beaten the game, I did enjoy playing it, and I felt it was important to address in this retrospective. While the story and characters are the same as the movie and show, the game does have plenty of elements to help it stand out. For example, it has chibi-style graphics for the overworld and combat, while also having a comic book-esque art style for cutscenes. There's also full-on voice acting, which I think is a first for the series. These two things are really unique and help give the game its own flair, despite commonalities with the anime and movie. There's also the combat, which, I'm gonna be honest, I think is one of the series' best. It's honestly the type of combat I wanted from Yokai Watch 4. It plays a lot like Buster's, but there are new mechanics such as weapons which change a character's playstyle, multiple hero forms to play as, with their own transformation cutscenes just like the anime, and a more in-depth focus on movement and dodging, which make it much different. The focus on dodging is especially important, as it's pretty much the core of the combat. In this system, a new key feature was added, dodge rolls. When successfully dodging out of the way of an enemy attack, a pink circle will appear near you. Activating the circle allows you to gain stat buffs, which you can customize in the menu, and also listen to disco versions of the pre-existing battle themes. The addition of all these mechanics result in really addictive gameplay that I can't get enough of. Add to that the fun of exploring a massive campus with great overworld traversal that includes seamless fast travel and brutal bosses that are fun to master with tight reflexes, and you have yourself a great time. The only drawback to this game, aside from the same story and characters, which isn't really that bad, are the gacha mechanics. While the gacha is present in pretty much every Yokai Watch game, apparently the gacha is especially bad in this game. I haven't used it at all in this game, so I really don't know for sure, but that's what I've heard. Also, you have to pay for DLC to actually finish the story, which is not cool. Overall, Y School Heroes is a pretty great game with a definite fun factor, and it's certainly worth checking out if you're able to purchase it. Finally, let's talk about the latest Yokai Watch anime. It was one of the worst pieces of media I've ever experienced. Alright, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time. Bye! Do I really have to talk about this? Fine. Yokai Watch Music Note, aka Yokai Watch 2021, is another soft reboot that does absolutely nothing new to change things up, and in fact regresses in quality. In terms of format, it uses the same as 2019, but adds a couple of segments, including a slapstick segment, a segment for fan art, and a segment that parodies various folktales. These are all decent, but not really my cup of tea. The side segments return, but with a major change. Rather than being part of a pre-established series, they're more of one-off stories that change every episode. This means that the writers made them really basic, and they just lack the creativity from previous series, making them pretty bland and boring. That leaves us with the main segments, starring the OG gang, Nate, Whisper, Jibanyan, the squad's all here. Oh, how nostalgia taints us all. First off, the iterations of these characters are really bad, except Jibanyan, because he's Jibanyan. Whisper is either greedy or selfish, or just a complete idiot that doesn't really do anything. He honestly is just now here to spout unfunny jokes and stand around waving his hands. And finally, Nate. In the OG series, Nate wasn't a perfect character. Although he had a kind heart and was epic at times, he could be selfish at times, and it was fun seeing him get his comeuppance when he deserved it. In 2019, he was a bit more weird and selfish, but he still maintained the same character traits. In 2021, however, he is so selfish and stupid that he should honestly be fired from role as main character, and be replaced, because it's really hard to root for a guy that is this much of a complete idiot in pretty much every episode. To be fair, he does get his fair share of recompense, but that doesn't annul how bad he was in the series. Now, let's talk about the situations these characters are placed in these segments. I'll be fully honest, I think the writers are unable to make proper episodes for the original series anymore, because these scenarios are just uninteresting. Oh man, Nate can't blow big bubblegum. Oh man, Nate can't get out of bed. Oh man, Nate can't catch bugs. These aren't interesting scenarios. Now I know what you may be thinking, but aren't there similar scenarios in the OG series? While that is true, there is a great factor that makes these episodes considerably worse: the comedy. This is the true underlying reason why I hate the series. The comedy is just so gaggy, and every episode they just have to have an outrageous gag that gets viewers. And I mean, some of these are way weirder than even the original series. As a quick demonstration, let me show you what I mean. I'm going to give 4 options of gags, 3 that are real, and 1 that's fake, and you have to guess the fake in 15 seconds. Ready? Go. And the answer was none. All of them were real, and also very disgusting. Just to be clear, I get why the gags are used. There's nothing really to hook the viewer in, with there being uninteresting premises or characters, so this is the best method to use. I get it. I really do. But could you at least innovate the comedy to make it enjoyable for viewers? Because rather than making me laugh, it just makes me extremely annoyed. There are also a couple more things that tick me off. 1. Multiple yokai from past seasons are reused, with worse accompanying gags. This completely destroys any sense of progression the show had, as Nate is no longer befriending more and more yokai, but just refighting old ones, making the show feel more useless. 2. When summoning yokai, the Yokai Watch no longer uses the iconic summoning songs, and now just plays the main theme. This is extremely baffling considering the fact that the promotional toy released alongside the anime had not just the old summoning songs, but remixes of them, making this decision even weirder. Overall, Yokai Watch 2021 is really disappointing, and has honestly made me lose faith in the original style. They did put out a movie for this anime, not counting an episode that they also premiered as a movie, and it was amazing, starring some of the characters from Yokai Watch 3. More of that, please. However, it was really short, and didn't fully embrace the potential of the story for how interesting it was. So sadly, this anime really left a bitter taste in my mouth, and actually made me lose a bit of interest in the franchise overall. But this is meant to be a nostalgic retrospective going over the franchise. I can't just end on a negative note. Why don't we add a bit of positivity, with a little help from some friends?
For me, Yokai Watch is a way to connect with people. Even when I first met Yokai Watch, it was a friend that recommended that game to me. Just the complexity and the whimsical feeling of Yokai Watch is it's so fun to talk about with your friends, and I slowly got more and more of my childhood friends into the games that we just formed a whole friend group around the franchise, and it was perfect. It was a beautiful childhood that I had. And even now, I still make new friends now online through this game. It's so magical how these things can connect people. And I'm really thankful for Yokai Watch to give me that chance to connect and make friendships and bonds with other people. And yeah, it's also just a beautiful game, and it's made by love, and you can really feel it in the games themselves. But yeah, that's what it means to me in short, in summary.
And finally me, Magalord. I got into this franchise around 5 years ago, when I watched the English dub of Season 1 on Netflix, where it is sadly not there anymore. I soon became enamored by the franchise, and devoured the entire anime, bought some of the games, and soon became a fan, leading to me to express my love for this franchise in this video today. I have to thank Level 5 and Nintendo for creating a beautiful and wacky series of games that has spawned lovable characters and immersive worlds, and a franchise that has quickly become one of my favorites of all time. And that leads us to the end of this retrospective. Thank you all so much for watching. Yokai Watch is a series that is certainly a guilty pleasure of mine, and I thought now, being the franchise's 10th anniversary, will be a great time to look back at its history of games and anime. So whether you're a diehard fan or a newcomer to the series, I certainly hope you enjoyed this little adventure. Once again, thank you all so much, and I hope to see you next time. I'm Magalord, and this has been my Yokai Watch retrospective.